Hello everyone, it's Sarah, the Tudor travel guide here, and I'm in Clerkenwell in the City of London on the trail of Henry VII. Yes, my friends, this video will accompany my write-up of the 1486 progress of Henry VII, which was of course the first of the Tudor reign. And it will see us start from here, the remains of St John's Priory in Clerkenwell, which was indeed where Henry VII set off from on his progress, and will take us via places such as Waltham Abbey and Cambridge, Lincoln, Nottingham, Doncaster and up to York. And along the way I'll be filming on location footage, not only from here in Clerkenwell, but also in Lincoln and of course in our final destination in York. So let's start our story, and I think we need to set a little bit of context. Of course, Henry won his right to be King of England at the Battle of Bosworth Field on the 22nd of August, 1485. He'd been in exile for many years, but as we will hear, he had been taught well about the art of kingship. And when he took the throne, at 28 years of age, he was undoubtedly a man on a mission. Leaving the blood-soaked fields of Bosworth behind, Henry headed immediately for the capital, who were aware that their previous Yorkist king, Richard III, had been slain in battle. There was obviously disquiet in the city, and it was Henry's job to come here and affirm his reign as rightful King of England. Henry was met at Shoreditch by the great and the good of the City of London, and then they formed in procession and went to St Paul's Cathedral, where Henry offered up the 3 banners that had been held aloft at Bosworth. Once Henry set up his headquarters initially at the Bishop of London's palace, directly adjacent to St Paul's, and also at Baynard's Castle, he set about the task of governing the realm and establishing the new Tudor dynasty. Now, to do this, we see Henry making a number of critical decisions. The first, a little bit ruthlessly perhaps, but somewhat wisely, was that he backdated the first day of his reign to the day before the Battle of Bosworth. This rendered anybody who had fought for King Richard III a traitor and allowed Henry to act ruthlessly and decisively against his enemies. But at the same time, of course, we see him offering largesse to those who had supported him in exile or indeed on the battlefield, distributing lands, title and wealth to his closest friends and supporters. One of the next things Henry needed to do was to establish an open parliament, but to do that he needed to be crowned. And within just a little over 2 months, indeed he was crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 30th of October 1485. He was not going to let the grass grow under his feet. Parliament was duly open, acts were passed, and the next important thing for Henry to do was to unite the houses of York and Lancaster, which of course he did by marrying Elizabeth of York, daughter of King Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, at Westminster Abbey at the end of January the following year, 1486. And indeed, by the way, by this time Elizabeth was already pregnant. This brings us to February. Henry has now secured the city. He has been crowned. He has a new wife. He has united the 2 warring houses and brought, ostensibly, an end to the War of the Roses. But all was not entirely as it should be, for in the north of England there was still discontent. Of course, the North had always been very fiercely loyal to the House of York, and in particular Richard III, who had been brought up at Midleham Castle in North Yorkshire. Rumours of uprising abounded, particularly from some of Henry's most implacable enemies, such as Francis, Lord Lovell, and the Stafford brothers. Both of them had taken up sanctuary at Colchester following the Battle of Bosworth. So, with London secure, Henry had a task on his hand. He wanted to show himself as the rightful and anointed King of England to his most northerly subjects. And so a grand northern progress was planned. And this would take Henry from his capital here in London to the great city of York in North Yorkshire, the northern capital of the county. Along the way, we are going to see Henry enact his role of king to perfection. He would impress upon the people his power in the great retinue of men on horseback that he would take with him. He would dress the part because it was not just important to be the king, but people wanted to see a king. And we see Henry bedecked in some of his finest cloth and gold and ermine as he made his grand entrance into York. And of course, we would see all the pageantry associated with that. Henry was saying to people that, yes, I have arrived and I am God-given's anointed here on earth to govern this realm, this kingdom of England. So having set the context for the progress, I wanted to bring us here on location to Clerkenwell to visit the place that Henry set off from with his grand entourage of men on horseback. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to the Priory of St John in Clerkenwell, or what remains of it. Now, originally the Priory was founded in the Holy Land in Jerusalem, and the order was an unusual one. It was the Order of the Knights Hospitaller, who were founded to care for travellers or the sick or the needy who were visiting the Holy Land on pilgrimage. And this particular priory was the headquarters in London. And because of its connection with overseas, it was also not only very wealthy, but in an incredibly well-connected order. And this made it of great interest to the crown. So you may be asking yourself, why did Henry VII start his progress from here? Well, there are perhaps a number of different reasons for that. The first, as I've just mentioned, is this particular order was not only wealthy but well connected, and it was used to hosting royal visitors. Beyond that gate, which was once the inner gateway to the Abbey precinct, was a large Abbey church and a range of lavish and palatial accommodation fit to accommodate any monarch. And so we had suitable housing here. Secondly, there's a little bit of an interesting history associated with this priory. Just the year before, Richard III had used the priory here to announce to the great and good of London that he had in fact no intention of marrying Elizabeth of York, contrary to popular rumour at the time. Not only that, but the prior at the time that Henry VII visited here was clearly held in high esteem by the king, because we can see that he was one of the signatories that had attested to the fact that there was no prohibition to the marriage of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Another good reason Henry may have chosen to base himself here at the beginning of the progress was to do with money. Now, one of the things you learn if you spend any amount of time looking at Henry VII and his life and his progresses is that he knew how to schmooze people with money and power. And as I've already mentioned, this particular order was a very wealthy, very well-connected one, so it would do no harm at all for the king to build up his relationship with the Priory of St John. And then finally, we have a very practical reason. Clerkenwell is based to the north of the City of London, and not too far away from here were two ancient Roman roads which headed north. One, the Great North Road, which today is our A1, and the second, Ermine Street, today our A10, both heading in a northerly direction. And in fact, we will see Henry VII leaving here and picking up Ermine Street and heading up towards Waltham Abbey and Cambridge on the first legs of his progress. But what about the Priory? What do we know of how it appeared at the time? Well, like most monastic institutions, it was a large complex of buildings. An outer courtyard was entered through, as we might expect, the first outer gateway. Today, you can walk up St John's Lane and be walking along the very pathway which would have connected the outer to the inner gateways, as surely Henry VII and his entourage must have done. And while you're here, all about you, you may notice certain road signs which give you a clue that once there was a very grand monastery by the name of St John in this area. Now, I've already alluded to the second gateway, which is directly behind me here. In fact, this is a later Tudor copy, but it stands on exactly where the original gateway did. So once you come through the inner gatehouse, you would have ended up in a large inner courtyard. Now, today this is called St John's Square, and I'm standing roughly where the Priory church once stood. And you can see the inner gatehouse in the distance, and this gives you a really good landmark to get a size or a feel for the size and scale of just how large this Priory complex once was. Now, sadly, nothing of that Priory church remains except the crypt, which you can visit today on guided tours. All about you, there would have been a whole range of monastic buildings, including a great hall, all the service offices, and of course the guest lodgings, which I have already mentioned. Now, when you walk through the inner gateway today, you will get a sense of the position of that inner courtyard, although, as you will see, it's much changed because, like most of the monastic institutions in England, sadly, despite the close association with the Crown, St John's Priory was closed at the dissolution of the monasteries, and of course, over time, many of its buildings were dismantled and destroyed. But of course, that was not the case on the 14th of March 1486, when Henry VII passed through this gateway and headed out, picking up probably the old Ermine Street as he headed towards Waltham Abbey. We have very little information about the first few stages of the King's progress. All that we hear from the herald who accompanied Henry on progress was that he went to Waltham and thence via the highway to Cambridge, where he was honourably received by the town and the university. Now, in my write-up of the progress, you will read in a lot more detail about these locations and some of my hypothesising about why Henry visited and where he may have stayed. However, when we think of Waltham Abbey, we must remember that not only was it a very holy site, it had long and deep connections with English royalty. And wherever royalty had been before, you can be sure that Henry VII would follow. Once again, we see him asserting himself and following traditions that had been followed by kings for centuries. Now, at Waltham Abbey, we don't know where Henry stayed. However, we do know that the abbey was enormous, and directly adjacent to it, on its northern side, were its claustral buildings, which included the abbot's lodgings. Now, in my research on the progresses of Henry VIII, I uncovered that this particular abbot's lodgings had permanent rooms allocated for the king and the queen, which actually is quite unusual, but it does show that this was a particularly important royal enclave and visited regularly by royalty, and I see no reason why Henry VII did not stay in those very rooms when he visited Waltham Abbey. Sadly, once again, the fate of Waltham Abbey is so similar to almost all of the monasteries that we hear about, including the Priory here at St John. It too was dissolved, and although part of the Abbey church survives, all the claustral buildings, including that old abbot's lodging, which became the King's house, has been completely lost to time. Henry's stay at Waltham Abbey was fleeting. He was on his way next to the great university city of Cambridge. Now, I'm going to pick up the story of Cambridge in the next part of this video, so stay tuned for that. But do remember, my friends, of course, that all my research and my full write-up of not only this location here in Clerkenwell, but also Waltham Abbey and all the other locations that I'll be talking about on this progress are included in your membership and available at both levels. So Henry VII has left the Priory St John in Clerkenwell, my friends, and I think we need to do the same because we need to hot-foot it on his trail. So I will pick up his story of his arrival at Cambridge in our next on-location venue, which will be Lincoln. I'll see you there.